So I'm going to present Amy Brown. And Amy Brown will be doing a workshop. The second facilitator, Zina Scallard, will be streaming into the session. So Amy will lead us through in this space, and Zina will come in. So thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much. Shall we wait for Zina first? Oh, there
I'm
you are.
here, my
Hey.
sister. I'm
Oh,
here. Can you
hey.
hear me? How are you?
Okay, let's get to it. Goeiemôre. I made a note here for myself, which is breathe, so I'm just going to do that. Check. Cool. Hi, I'm Amy Brown Hendrikse. My pronouns are Brown and Browns. In moving into love through fear for me, religiously having gratitude as the conduit between those two states, I feel like I can't actually proceed without giving thanks. So Zina and I agreed on this. I want to give thanks for the persistency of my ancestors, for my great-great-grandmother who was brought to the Cape as property and not a person, to my great-grandmother Olive, who I never met, but essence still fills the walls in Vitro Road's family home. To my grandmother, whose second name is my first name, she birthed 4 daughters, who birthed 5 daughters. Give thanks to my mother, whose waters transported me here, just like the tides brought my lineage here from across the continents. Give thanks to my aunties. They showed me strength in motherhood and the type of woman that I want to be, and give thanks to my dearly departed favorite auntie, who maybe showed me the opposite, but also showed me love in action. Give thanks to my sisters, through blood and intention. And also give thanks to my sisters who have to fight to be seen as sisters. I love you and I see you.
Thanks, Amy. So, greetings, beautiful peoples. My name is Zina Scallard. I just want to say that I'm honored in creating, sharing, and defining space with everyone here today. I firstly want to acknowledge the backs on which we stand, the backs upon which we build our knowledge and forwarded our futures and created our concepts of self in this day and age. I want to acknowledge the violence that exists here in this very space when it comes to the ways in which we define and validate and silent knowledge if it's not packaged or articulated in a known colonial framework. I acknowledge my fellow sisters and colleagues who have disrupted the space and spoken their truth and vulnerability during this conference. I want to personally acknowledge and raise the place that queerness holds in our histories, but also the place in which it holds our imagining of our futures. I want to acknowledge the land on which we stand as an indigenous and spiritual. I want to acknowledge our people who were displaced, violated, and deemed invaders. I want to acknowledge the spirits that occupy the space and who linger here. I want to acknowledge the majority of our Mensa who are still displaced, still landless, still fighting for dignity and acknowledgement. I speak into the space, their presence, their spirits, and their humanity. Welcome.
Thank you. So it was a whirlwind that blew us here. But from the rail, we unveil all this newness, and we can sail with no sail because our route is clear. And we can leave home for unknown destinations, and please leave your phone because we compose our own vibrations. Creations volgens die onderwerp van besondere wonderwerk. Gangams for loved ones whose clap tongues erupt love. And shukran for new sons that choose none and harness our godness regardless of hardships. And the musings of the moon's Beulah lunacy. I want us to link hands for holding space and give thanks for unfolding grace. Cool. Sometimes the mind is there and the body needs to be reminded that it's also there, you know, like you deal with something and the mind knows the problem's over, but the body still needs to remember. So I'm just gonna like slat a young beatbox, and I just want y'all to just move your bodies like us, yeah. I know it's very evident, but do it with me, people. Come, shake it. Yes, your body is present in the space. Yes. Zina and I were talking about, artivism, revolution artivism as the gateway to that synergy of expression and intention, and also picking the terms, we're coming from multiple spaces, multiple experiences, knowing what we mean when we say what we say in this magical spell casting realm that we co-creating for each other, knowing that words are placeholders for our intentions, so using them as such. So when we explore love and we call love, you must mean all love. You must mean pure love, and you must mean all of the above and not just your love. If you feel it's physical, you may deem it clinical. Pray, preach, it's biblical, but we see it spiritual. Here we go. As ek vir jou kyk, dan sien ek myself, en as ek met jou kyk, dan sien ek myself. Ons benodig geneesende verses as nurses en liriek is myself. En ek is siek as als 'n bietjie las met 'n ander se stukkie vir ander die scripting. Shifting to re-acknowledge what knowledge is. Knowledge in trees and leaves. Knowledge from mommies, knowledge from college degrees and scholarly themes. Release. Let's not be trapped in the tactical, factical baggage, because life is toch maar practical magic. This urgency is urging me to merge earthly reason with our worldly season and emerge in perfect sequence. Because love is more than a theory just passed down. Query gods, Brown. So we wanted to move into this idea of spaces, holding space, and Zina's going to share some of her experiences from the work that she's done as a visual artivist.
Thanks, Amy. I mean, visual artivist, I'm not sure, but organizer and artivist, sorry. So yeah, I maybe just wanted to firstly say thank you. And then I wanted to start us off with some reflections on space and what exactly that means for me in the spaces I organize within. I am an activist and an organizer and coordinator within the civil society sector for the past 10 or so years. And I believe that all space is co-created. All space is collective in nature. And I don't believe that space is only a physical manifestation. Like even now, in our new normal, we are creating space despite the fact that I am not physically present. So all space is made up of energy and spirit, histories, herstories, the political, the traumas, and the experiences that are unspoken. And so I feel it appropriate to share maybe a personal story that I experienced in the early part of my organizing career when I was organizing a transnational Black Girls Only queer workshop. And I'd spent months planning, communicating and coordinating and pulling everything together. And I was also one of the main facilitators for the space. And after everyone arrived and got seated, I took up the center of the circle to welcome everybody and to kick off the program. But before I could even greet some of the attendees, who mind you, I had invited, but this is all over email, no one's actually seen me. Some of the attendees began to violently start questioning my presence and why I was even in the space if this space was for Black Girls Only event. This for me was quite a defining moment when thinking about space, when thinking about how we define space, how we navigate space, the politics in space, but most importantly, also the embodied violence in space, So before I continue, I just want to maybe cue a video that can help contextualize the rest of our conversation. Could you please play the video?
I wake to the touch of the morning light. you lie next to me. Beneath, I'm feminine and free. But as I step out of my dream, I wake to this body and carry on through hell.
Would you be prepared to take up a gun and kill someone in order to achieve what you would regard as your freedom?
Now, I know I can.
Kweza amapolisa.
She's gonna say, gay rights are human rights.
This is Simon. That's me. I really loved him. Sometimes I hated him. He changed my life.
Because it is part of your lives, it affects your lives in every way, and the fact that you are not people of color does not make you safe from the effects of it. Do you hear what I'm saying? Yeah.
Instead of running, I said.
Thank you so much for that video. So that's one of the spaces I co-found and co-organize within, and it's called the Queer Feminist Film Festival. And UWF has really been a space that I could organize within and was birthed as a place for LGBTQI+ persons to gather and engage through film, art, and dialogue. One thing that I learned about this space, or from the space, is representation. So from our first year, we organized in Kailicha, and we created space for building bridges across generational lines, across academic lines, across organizational lines, and across community lines. The issue was that despite our intentions to be as representative as possible, we were still perpetuating the same exclusions that institutions and the system in its entirety perpetuates. And there was a call from young queer activists to not center academic approaches and languages within the space, because the language and the ways in which we were organizing wasn't representing the realities that we were, for other communities that we were organizing for. So in response, in 2020, we really had to have difficult conversations amongst ourselves in terms of how do we shift this? How do we become more conscious of this? And how do we change this, right? So in 2020, we responded by this call by broadening our hosting to at least 5 communities on the Cape Flats, and also offering it online as a resistance in terms of hard lockdowns and COVID-19 restrictions. But most importantly, to hand over the UWF platform to community organizers to lead their own festival programming, and not for us to set a program and then get people to come, right? So the lesson here is that no matter how inclusive or representative you attempt to be, for me as an organizer, I've learned the chances that you exclude or further isolate particular groups are high. And finally, art and dialogue also allows us to create space and ways of engaging that are alternative to the ways that we traditionally think about space and engagement. Another space that I organize within is the We See You collective. And this was a collective of artivists and activists that took up occupation in a mansion in Camps Bay. And we gathered with our whole selves as Black and colored activists and human beings in an attempt to disrupt the narratives and the responses to the land issue in South Africa. And some key lessons that I can share here about space is that, one, this was a conscious undertaking and somewhat of a live social experiment, so to speak, because we were a group of humans from different racial, cultural, class, and historical backgrounds with different experiences of the same issues. We never could really fully anticipate the violence and its impact that we among ourselves would inflict upon ourselves and each other, but also the compounded impact of the violence that the world was throwing our way. And yeah, I mean, how do you create cohesion and ensure genuine inclusion on this micro level, just a group of activists, let alone an entire society to engage in dialogue and resistance on a land issue, you know? So what I learned here was that we need tools and approaches which will support us to lead real unlearning that supports us in dismantling our behaviors, thinking, and ways of being. We cannot begin to dream about alternative futures and realities without realizing that we embody viscerally the violence that the system asserts upon us. So just to conclude, in both instances, hard conversations, self-reflection, group reflection, and conscious dismantling of the ways that we were thinking, being, and doing is absolutely imperative. Most importantly, I think that this work requires that these changes and shifts in space happen in tangible and experienced ways. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks, sis. Physical space, definitely, but also thinking about like talking about shrines, deifying a place, adding sanctity, adding intention to it, just with the words and the way we all codify terms that we're all happy to go about, you know. For me as a scribe, I'm excited about just fusing my own confusions and muses and substance abuses into something that's like bigger than me and transcends bigger than me. Just moving through finding what your space is, because that's so important. You can't expect to heal in a place that's not quiet enough to rest, for example, even just in the physical realm of things. So I found myself moving through space, academic space. I mean, I can say it was a sweltering day on the African continent and not a single soul in the poli-sci, in the pol-sci department cared about my actual superlatives in my essay. It was clear to me that's not necessarily the space, maybe not the right time, but certainly not the right space for that. Becoming triggered and aware of how these spaces get navigated, and they will rename a building and they will add suffixes to the end of the word, but you still won't be included, and they will still call me a female rapper. So the full circle moment needs to come around. I need to also understand what that means, shifting the expectation, understanding how I can curate my own safety, which always kind of makes me a little bit itchy, because if I'm accepting the misnomer that one space is safe, it means I'm accepting that another place should be or could be unsafe. That just, you know, practically, empirically, I understand there are movements when like space in the echo chamber and conversation evolution in the echo chamber is not a sustainable version of that space, you know. Academics perhaps sit and recodify words about queerness, about existence that will never filter down to the street where that boy who wears makeup is making more of a protest by just being himself than any amount of well-defined tra-la-la, as it were. So also my own fluidity, understanding healing as something that's divergent, dynamic, needing to create space within myself, shifting my own expectations, understanding what I filter through my own trauma. I found like home domicile in the space of hip hop, and I don't mean just the rhyming or the actual subcultures of it. I mean within the 5 pillars of the 4 pillars of self-expression, there's this fifth one in hip hop called knowledge of self. So probably the most overlooked pillar of hip hop is knowledge of self. So knowing what that meant, feeling like I'm everything, moving into a space where hip hop is essentially a queer colored lighty because it's everything, and still not being seen as everything, realizing that in this exact thing that I worship, being called a queer or being called a woman is actually synonymous with being weak, being whack, being cuck. Couldn't reconcile that until I realized that I have to stop pining to a system that is violent towards me. I just stopped waiting for affirmation, validation from a system that innately hates me without them even knowing it, without them even claiming it, just moving through understanding what you get called versus what you respond to. Just transcending, you know, understanding my own unique African experience as a mixed person, something that wasn't taught to me at school, something I had to figure out for myself. And I suppose, you know, these that at the end of the day that MC, so at the end of the day, whether you're a girl or a boy or a carrot, in the space of hip hop, they're always going to be measuring dictionaries. So step into my world. Shy girls will get their minds hurled. And if you're the kind who's fry and likes to rhyme words, they will lie and say that it's a guy's purse. But then he said that she said she deserves an apology because she said that he said he's averse to equality. And observe the dichotomy, pervert the psychology, then revert back to words for the hurt that is following. And honestly, patriarchy is a party I want to gate crash. From the private estates to the Cape Flats. And to state rap facts, I quote harder bars in my voice note than any throat noise that the boys wrote. You see, they see fame, but really it's queen, king, Q in between them. Scribing by day, then filling quotas in the PM. Silly Owens, I've seen them. And the rhymes can apparently pride damage, and you'll find that I'm not the kind to ride fellas, and my challenge is constantly being asked what the hardest part of being a female artist. Well, sir, my body parts is not really the worry when my task is scholarly remarks, sis. And if your skirt's too high, they say use your noodle. And if your work's too quiet, they say you're using Google. You're too unusual, QAF. Evacuate, stage left. So maybe the space is my place as an artist is the gap in the market. Maybe while they faffing on Snapchat and squeezing into jackets for the market, they'll wake up to find my gap in the market. Zina and I were wanting to open up the space to maybe have us just share a little bit about your guys' experiences about space, or any comments or questions that you wanted to before we proceed into the latter part of our presentation. Is that fine?
I'm on duty with the mic. All right, so if anybody would like to chime in, would like to share, would like to reflect on this notion of space and how we experience space. Two hands. I'll start with Monique and then I'll go to Nono.
This experience of space that you've described, and disruption, interruption, resistance, it hit me like a ton of bricks actually when I was sitting there. I was like gobsmacked actually after a long time to share space with people. Even though I prepared, I felt so overwhelmed. And it has to do with this language that I never critically evaluated before in my self-reflection of this, what I'm gonna call journey. But so then this experience of space and time and the link to activism and feminism, and just the link to self and wildness, and the collective consciousness of this wildness that is like evaporating right now. And so then that collective knowing of an expression of creativity in time and space, and as a continuum, has really, I just sat here and that I became overwhelmed. I lost track of my train of thought, but that is the I think, part of the journey of the power of going into the wild and unlearning. And so there's this juncture that happens, and this connectivity, but reconnectivity with the self that is different in spaces that were not created at first for the marginal or the oppressed. So so that feeling of that perception of space as a feeling and emotion and something that can transcend time as we know it is also a powerful vehicle of queerness that I think is important in the space and time that we're in right now. So thank you for bringing the power of rhyme and helping me and us to ascend from the normative ways of seeing and knowing and doing and perceiving time and space.
Thank you.
And now that's no.
Hello. So I was just thinking about, what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about space, and I'm particularly thinking about, is it Zena? Your Zena.
Zena. Yeah, Zena.
Yes, I was thinking about, what you were saying about your experience of being kicked out of For Black Girls Only. And I was thinking, right, about space and protecting space, and what protecting space really means, and how self-protection is often, done via self-isolation, and I'm not saying, so my comments are not to say that they were right or wrong in kicking you out. That's not an argument that I want to make right now. But I'm thinking about self-protection via self-isolation, and I'm thinking of how do we draw the line between what is preservation and what's exclusion, what's preservation and what's violent. And it's going to sound problematic for first 2 seconds, but I'm going to clarify. I'm thinking about For Black Girls Only space, and then I'm thinking about, is it Orania, that Afrikaans space, and I'm thinking that when you read it from the top, both of these two spaces seem to be doing the same thing. They are predicting an identity, right? But on the other hand, we have one space that is protecting a very violent and empirical culture, and then on the other hand, we have a space that is, after centuries of being denied space, that is saying that, no, but we are gonna cultivate the space for ourselves, and we're entitled to this, to create a space of joy, of pride, and, to preserve what we have without external forces. And then I think what, for me, then that the conversation that comes from that is that, what are external forces, right? And then it becomes a question of identity, that how do we define what is Afrikaans culture, and how do we define what is Blackness, because it's for Black girls only. So then that's a conversation of identity. And I was just thinking, how do we draw the lines between these things? But there were a lot of nice words that were said between your guys' discussion and the first comment that was made. And I was thinking about, collectivity, and about maybe where we can begin, not to monopolize anything, but I'm thinking that maybe where we can begin to draw the lines is with history and with context and with narrative of how does Orania exist differently to For Black Girls Only, right? And I'm thinking that some things do need to be disrupted, but also some things do need to be kept safe and preserved, so how do we begin to negotiate what is what. And I'm thinking that, you know, with queer clubs, there was a conversation that was had the other day that there's recently this voyeurism that's beginning to happen from heterosexual people where they go to queer clubs as heterosexual people, and they invite violence into a space that queer people have cultivated for themselves, saying that, you know what, we just want to be happy here without all of your guys' problematics. You know, we don't want to be subjected into that space. And then heterosexual people go and say, you know, these clubs are fun, we just want to go have a good time and hang. But, you know, they invite things that they've cultivated the space trying to escape. Yeah, but I was just thinking about, you know, what needs to be predicted, what needs to be preserved, and what needs to be disrupted. Yeah.
Response.
Is there another?
You want to respond, Zina?
Would you like to respond, or
Yeah. So I just maybe wanted to firstly thank you for that offering. So for me, the reason why I shared that specific story, right, was to illustrate the ways that, because the subject is space, for me, it's important that I illustrated the ways in which even space that I create as a colored, bisexual person with all of my intersecting identities and experiences and ways that I show up in the world, in a space that I attempted to co-create as safe for others like me. I, even in that space, had to qualify and quantify and validate my Blackness. And number one. Number two, the fact that that example is not unique to just that one experience, but it's something that I come across, or that we come across many times within civil society, gender justice, social justice movement spaces, where, you know, politics, there's an assumption that there's shared politics or there's shared understanding of those politics, and difference. There's a very low ability to kind of hold difference without allowing that to spill over violently. Or be able to kind of hold space for difference in a way that doesn't other difference. Number two. Number three, I'm not sure, like, I can't necessarily speak on Urania because I'm not Afrikaner and I'm not white, and I don't know, like, that's not my business. The same with how I see, you know, working with men when it comes to gender-based violence. That's not my labor, but you know, this concept of protecting space, I think that's a really interesting thing that we should be able to unpack, or we could unpack in the session, because I think that, you know, if I'm thinking about the Queer Feminist Film Festival, for example, the media and mainstream narratives about queer identity and about lived realities of people that sit on the margin, whether that be sex workers, whether that be landless people, whether that be people of color that live on the Cape Flats and that are living in a particular way on the periphery of the system and the periphery of us sitting in this space. That needs to be disrupted, and that space needs to be created, needs to be co-created, and needs to be protected. So I just maybe, yeah, that's my response to that. But at the later stage, maybe if we can just, you know, unpack the protecting of space, I think that's quite an interesting.
Fantastic.
Thing. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've got one comment that is online. So I'm going to allow the person to stream in and split the screen from Yaliwe Clark. So Yaliwe will be on in a minute, in a second.
Hi. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wow, guys, this is amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation and setting everything up this way. I came in a little bit late, so Zina, I missed the beginning of what you were saying. I have a couple of questions, just need to breathe. Because what you were talking about, Zina, brought up so many memories that are emotionally packed. And I'm looking at you and I'm like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Are you okay? Because you've convened, you've been part of communities. I've had the opportunity to be part of those spaces that you've curated in groups of people. You never work on your own, Zina. You're working always in groups of people. And that's very powerful. It's also very complex. It's very, very a big part of what it means to do this kind of feminist work that centers collectivity. And I'm talking about collectivity that is really rooted and grounded in where people are at, you know, their positionalities, whether it's across, all the accesses, right? All the ways in which we are. So what I wanted to think with you about is the way what we have learned, the many Zinas, iterations of Zina-ness in all these different spaces, what it is we have learned and are learning about holding these spaces in a way that also engages with what's happening emotionally, psychosocially, but I'm thinking about it also in terms of psychosocial, spiritual shifts in energy that are happening in these spaces. And I am remembering the QFFF that we were part of organizing. We've had, I think, 3 ones. We're on to our 4th one coming up. I'm really excited. I'm really nervous. I'm really everything, because that space has evolved. It's evolving. There are different things happening. And I wanted to hear from you. What do you think you have learned when it comes to those moments similar to one in which I found you describing, where there is huge emotional and spiritual tension? We're sitting with this and we start eating at each other, and inside we're feeling pain and it's tense, and there's some silence and there's some talking. And I've seen in the QFFF, we have changed our approach to those moments. And I just wanted you to speak about what you've learned from the shift in approach to those kinds of moments when it comes to QFFF. Yeah, don't know if that makes sense. Yeah?
Yes, hello, Yaliwe. It's amazing to be connected again. Thank you so much for that question. It's loaded, it's layered, it's complex, but thank you. So I mean, I'm also conscious of time, so I'll try and keep it brief. I think that's one of the lessons as a personal Zina, is to not be scared to take up space and to not constantly center others all the time at the expense of self. And I think that this is an experience that many women, many queer people, many people that are working in community, that are working within service, that are offering, that are healing, forget to or are taught not to center self, and are taught to kind of put self on the back burner. So that's one. The other thing I've learned, especially through the QFFF space, and also just organizing with others outside of QFFF as well, is that we cannot only exist in the brain. We cannot only exist in the thinking head realm. Our entire bodies, because our lived realities are visceral experiences. When we talk about violence, it's a visceral experience. When we talk about joy, it's a visceral experience. When we talk about collective sharing of space and creating of space, that's visceral. It's in our entire beings and those who are connected to us that are experiencing that. And I think that building muscle to hold difference, building muscle to hold differing experiences, different opinions, different ideas and ideologies and praxis. I think that that is one of the key lessons, because it's one thing for us to say we are a queer feminist space, but it's a different thing to hold the fact that queerness is not experienced in an homogeneous way, that feminism is not an homogeneous ideology, that everybody understands it or lives it, or thinks about it in one way. And so the capacity to build capacity to hold difference in a way that celebrates, honors, and acknowledges it, but also is capable of holding the discomfort and dis-ease that comes with. Because that's disruptive. And there must be capacity to celebrate and to honor disruption, you know. 2, 3, I think that being part of the co-founding team and, you know, leading this festival for the past 4 years, this year is the first year that I personally am stepping away from the coordination and the forward facing. And the reason why is because I've realized that the very ways that I experienced gatekeeping within my organizing career and within the spaces I organize in, that's the very thing that I'm running the risk of perpetuating. You know, so yes, I sit with the institutional knowledge. Yes, I sit with the history of like where these things come from, why we did certain things the way we did it, but I'm also gatekeeping and excluding fresh perspectives. I'm also not allowing space for piloting of new ways of doing things. You know, newness doesn't necessarily mean that old is broken. Newness is just a different iteration or a different face, you know, of how this thing could look and move and feel. But also, if we're saying that we are for community and we're creating community and we're co-creating, then the space needs to be reflective of who we are organizing with and who we are organizing for and why we are organizing. And finally, you know, resourcing and support has been one of the biggest things that we have learned as a festival. But also that I've learned as an activist, you know, as an organizer, that's an individual with only an undergrad degree, you know, because that's another thing, you know, speaking in a space where we hear scholars, and I have heard that word referred to, or that identity, you know, referred to in this space. And for the longest time, personally, you know, I'm the first to graduate out of my family, and that was a long road for my single mother and I to kind of walk in order to ensure that I get this thing, you know. But just the ways in which I would enter space and navigate space because I didn't have the language to articulate the ways that others were, or I wasn't able to articulate or understand the ideologies, you know, that for me made me feel that, you know, my place, my resourcing and my personal capacity was very limited. But there was a shift in my perspective as a person, and then that translated to how I organize, but it's also just part of a bigger picture. So let me stick to one thought. Personally, I had to validate that it didn't necessarily take a professorship for me to know what I know and to experience or to know what I experience, and to also know that my experience isn't the only experience. And the communities in which I work have expertise. They are experts at their own realities. You know, they are expert at their needs. They are experts at what's missing. They are experts at what's going wrong. They are experts at designing and dreaming up alternative futures for themselves, you know, and the ways in which that's documented doesn't necessarily sit in a book or doesn't necessarily sit in a conference, you know, but sits within community town halls or sits on a WhatsApp group or sits. Yeah, it takes very different shapes and forms. But coming back to this resourcing idea or lesson, I don't think that QFFF is unique in terms of the experience of a lack of resourcing in order to kind of keep ourselves sustainable, because LBT, particularly LBTQ organizations, collectives, informal organizations, activists from the global south, this is a common theme and a common thread, you know, that the lack of resourcing for activist work and social justice work and gender justice work is limited. And so that then calls for a level of resilience and resourcefulness. And which we see, you know, the fact that we are 4 years old, my God, I don't even think we thought that we would last this long, because it literally started with 3 people and tapping into connections and tapping into our own pockets to be like, okay, I can pay for transport, I can pay for this. And 4 years later, we have budget, you know, 4 years later, we online and we now have to operate Zoom apparently, and we have a Zoom account, you know. So yeah, I think those are some of the key lessons, and I maybe just want to also hand over to Amy, because Amy was featured in our festival last year, and Amy brought an amazing energy and power and shifted this narrative around queerness and art and the industry when it comes to creative means of expression and artivism. So, Amy, are we?
How's it? Thank you, sis, for always sharing. You always have the pearls to add into the things. I feel like even relating to what you were talking about, space and protecting space, generally my first response is like the why. It's like, what was the intention of the thing? I think that probably resonates like throughout everything I've done, like Asperus doing it, like with purpose, you know, like then that if you are in a space where people also have been fortunate or privileged enough for a certain thought capacity, then they can maybe feel that intention. And then words just become another little layer, and titles of black and D and I becomes like another codifying layer when we all understand we are all thinkers, we are all women even, we are all, you know, then that when it becomes transcendent. And maybe in the empirical, that's a little bit more happy sounding than the truth, but I do feel like myself with no academic chappies in a space like this makes me excited to be able to rewrite the kind of reality that I want to create in. And hopefully it's like, I'll tell you my pronouns, but talk to me nice and it's cool, you know? Oh yeah. Sis, I was thinking maybe I will intro and then you can do your show off shrines. I'm gonna take it over now. Okay. We have been coming back to this thing about the terms, because that's what all you have sometimes when you have this different realities. All you have to do is codify what the terms could be. So Sina and I were talking about something like shrines, and I've been on a personal journey for God, and I found it through whatever your personal denotation is of that concept. And it just took me back to this ancient idea of like the sun, you know, the most kind of reasonable, in my mind, consistent version of something to worship. It sticks out every morning. It knows, you know, it does only good things. It sustains all the life, and it doesn't leave me with as many questions as any of the other forms of thinking. So got me thinking on this thing about shrines. Are we creating shrines for the thinkers, or is it the thoughts? Is it the thoughts that then manifests ingenuity and contrast and divergence? So it's not facts alone that we can create shrines to. It's to that collective consciousness that we can record, but we can't claim it. You know, IP, all of that is lovely for what it is, but there is something at play that's bigger than that. And these pre-existing shrines predated to predatory, all of these things. So also what in my journey as a tri-continental body, trying to figure out what that means, I also realized I had to shift what I think an answer is. Because now, how do I fit my colored story into a white character arc? You know, what does it mean? How does my character evolve? What's the expectation of her? She has to become more brown. She has to reject the flat iron and embrace co-sisters. And it's not the truth, you know, I'm everything. So I can't be asked to conform into something. I can't create a shrine to a version of literature, call it white, call it systematic, that doesn't also write me into the pages. Why did it take so long for me to even be exposed to Symmetry, Erasmus, Oh, Habiba Badarun, why did it take so long? Why in the filtering through what I was exposed to, did it take so long for me to actually hold on to that and be able to have this reconciliation for myself? Like recently, like now the other day, that reasonably anybody who has more questions and answers about who they are, genetically, however, they could claim themselves colored. I'll make you honorary colored, because that's essentially what it is. It's in the cracks. It's in the, Mo and I were talking about it. It's in the cracks, in the voids that we codify who we are actually. So we can't make shrines to people and we can't make shrines of facts. But you can hold your own space. Whether it's you processing imposter syndrome, whatever it is, you can hold space. You can very unlikely expose and expect another person to hold space, or another group, if you don't hold space for your own integrity and for your own voice. Definitely also writing your own story. So we become, our bodies, our living bodies become these shrines that is not that hard to understand, you know. Also having being fortunate enough to be exposed to Dr. Abrams from a very young age, dealing with eczema, feeling like maybe my genetics don't like living here, because why am I itching all the time? And why am I coughing? And what's with the, you know, asthma and hay fever? Like, surely. But then also just feeling like I'm sitting at the cool kids table in the Western Cape with this plethora of endemic plants that's basically like healing for coloreds, you know? How lucky have I be to even think of something like that? So if we are going to make shrines, let me just wrap it up by saying, we can't just decolonize your name of our pets. You know, you can't buy pink Himalayan salt when there's salt in the Kalahari, because it sounds nice, you know? So if we are going to build shrines, can we build shrines to, can we write poetry to Buchu, and to Wilde Els, and to Kougoed, and to Daga, and to Mpepu? Away.
Yeah, resonates completely.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Shall we are running a little bit over time, but this is our story. So and I think that what you've just said is just so powerful. It would be lovely to get some reactions, some responses, some questions, just a few, and then 5 minutes, and then we can go. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Tiffany.
I don't have a question. It's a comment. I wanted to thank you for bringing your grandmother and your great grandmother and bringing that whole tricontinental self into the room. I think the dispossession of land is a powerful dispossession, but it's not ours. We don't own it. It's not ours. It owns us. And so like the thing that you just said now about, you know, the being in integrity with ourselves is about being able to hold on to the multiple selves that are walking with all of us there, and they show up in our dreams, and they show up in things that you know you didn't get taught in this life. So I appreciate so much your asking us to press harder into that muscle of difference, because we are carrying the dupe, right? The dupe of like protect this nation state, or the dupe of protect this identity. And I'm not somebody who's post identity, but we have more capacity to do more with our understanding than we're letting ourselves do. We have much more capacity. So thank you for your grandmother.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. Anybody else want to feed into what was just said? Nomusa, anything from Zoom? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a beautiful note upon which to end the morning session. I think we've been reminded so many ways, I think, of the muscles maybe that we do not lean into. And I will say to everyone this afternoon, of course, we start at 3 o'clock again with our Zoom program. And we will be having, oh, I've lost my mind and I can't remember what we'll be having. We'll have our panels, and we will have the performance at 4 o'clock, Rahima Chachaje. And then we will have the featured panel in the evening, which is at 5:30 to 6:30, which is on Healing Waters, transnational feminisms. It's all coming back to me. Transnational feminisms at 5:30 to 6:30. We've got performing gendered identities. I think it's our first panel in the afternoon, if not our second. So please do look at the program and join in the conversation from the, you know, your couch, from your home, from whichever space you want to join us. Thank you.
Thank you.